For the first 13 years of my life, I lived a carefree and rather isolated life on a farm on the Canadian prairie. So before you feel really sorry for me and my isolation, I have to tell you there were some perks to that lifestyle. And one of them was that I learned to drive a stick shift old Volkswagen Beetle when I was 9. Yes, that's a perk. I could barely see over the dash, and that didn't stop me from just careening around that yard, and I never once hit that pond that I had to go around all the time. I really marvel at the trust my dad placed in me to let me actually do that. But I never knew that it would be he who would inspire my lifelong love for driving. So who knows, Aravis? So even on that farmyard, I remember trying to get up to the highest speed possible before I would have to slow down again so that I could make that curve and, of course, avoid the pond. Life comes at us fast. It did then, it still does. And it seems it's faster and faster all the time. We feel it, and even those in the ancient world that Dave read about felt it. I imagine that the followers of Jesus could hardly keep up with all that they were confronted with as they tried to figure out who Jesus was and how do you actually follow him. In this text that Dave just read, we encounter 3 distinct events, each of which could itself have been a rabbinical school curriculum or a driver's ed curriculum for months. The first had to do with Jesus' identity. He sets the stage by taking his followers to one of the epicenters of the region. Now remember, they lived in occupied territory. It was no democracy, it was a totalitarian regime. And within the Roman Empire, there were many cities named after conquering military and political leaders. When his followers respond to the question Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" they list well-known religious leaders like John the Baptizer, Elijah, Jeremiah, safe answers. This kept Jesus on a small and familiar platform that they were familiar with from their past. As long as they remained isolated and minded their own business, no harm done. So Jesus presses them further to see whether any of them were paying attention to the significance that his presence and mission represented. It's noteworthy that he asks this question, "Who do you say that I am?" in a stronghold city of the Roman Empire, Caesarea Philippi, a place that honored both Caesar and Herod Philip, who had been given control over that region. This place just exuded Roman authority. Roman rulers were revered, even worshipped. If someone was overheard saying, "Jesus is the Christ," in this environment, they could have been executed immediately. Why? Because Christ is the Greek translation for the Hebrew word Messiah, which means the one anointed as liberating king. And to add to that, a son of the living God just added insult to injury because Caesars called themselves sons of God. No wonder Jesus was later executed at the hands of the empire. So what Peter gives us his own statement of faith was both a strong spiritual and a political statement. You are the Christ, Son of the living God. Jesus commends him for hitting the nail right on the head, but he adds that this kind of insight comes from none other than God alone. Some things come at us so fast that we truly don't ever figure them out by ourselves. This question and answer test, which Peter passed brilliantly, it is followed up with a lecture about what this statement, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," will bring about in the future. What these students heard next shocked and disturbed them. Religious leaders would be furious with Jesus. There would be suffering, ultimately an execution, and then rising from the dead after 3 days. Preposterous. This is not what they imagined who their Messiah, their liberating king would be like at all. So instead of contradicting their beloved teacher publicly, this wonder child, Peter, takes him aside and says quietly, "This can never be. Don't you remember who you are? Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God? Suffering and death will not, indeed, it cannot be what comes to you. God forbid it." The response is swift. It came at Peter very quickly. "Get yourself behind me, you Satan. You are a stone that could make me stumble, for you are not thinking God's thoughts, you are thinking human thoughts." Well, Peter did not see that coming at all. How in the world could someone who was there to liberate be killed? Don't we identify with that? Trying to figure Jesus out is confusing, and we can admit that. In addition, what we see peripherally said and spoken by other Christians on social media feeds and on our devices, on our screens on our devices, doesn't mesh at all with what the Hebrew prophet Isaiah predicted about the coming liberator. This is what he said. "He won't cry out or shout aloud. He won't break a bruised reed. He won't extinguish a faint wick. But he will surely bring justice." That's Isaiah 42. Not an image of a strong, liberating persona. That's why Jesus' followers were baffled. It is difficult to wrap our brains around a narrative that is different from the one we've associated with God and with our faith and with the expressions of faith that we've known for a long, long time. Yet this is exactly what Jesus called and still calls his followers to do. All of them were steeped in Hebrew tradition and had heard prophecies of the coming liberator for as long as they could remember. What Jesus said about suffering and death was as inexplicable to his followers as some things that we hear today. And Peter got it so wrong. I think we would say, understandably so. But Jesus moves on. Our text tells us that a mere 6 days later, Jesus takes them up to a mountain. And what do you think of when you think of the mountains? I think of rest, a retreat, rejuvenation, being refreshed in nature. So when Jesus' followers see a vision with dazzling lights and the appearance of two historical giants whom they recognize as Moses and Elijah, they may have thought, we've arrived in paradise. Here was their opportunity to connect the present with the past. They had a grid for that. Again, Peter bursts out, "Let's just stay here. We can build cabins for every one of us." And he never did finish that statement because he interrupted that scene before he had really thought about it to the end. And similar to what happened at Jesus' baptism, a voice comes from the heavens to affirm Jesus' identity as God's own, God's beloved on whom divine favor rests. This voice of God confirms Jesus' reliability and credibility. Listen to him is the unmistakable call of that moment. This time, Jesus didn't need to address Peter after that. The ending of the event brought clarity, at least more clarity. This was not a mountain retreat to retrench in the old system along with Moses and Elijah, but a call to engage. But engage in what? That piece is left unsaid. And the only directive that is given is listen to him. Jesus' followers had 3 very distinct experiences, one right after the other, and they came at them fast. It's almost as if Jesus has given them as much exposure to the different aspects of who he is, what he represents, and what he stands for quickly, as if time is running out. It's like they're cramming for a test. As they're confronted with new material or a new driving track, I guess you could say, they sometimes got it right, but most of the time they were way off base. They had clear expectations about what kind of a person this deliverer, this liberator would be. This expectation was based on what they knew. They knew the Hebrew Scriptures, and they were filled with accounts of conquering military campaigns. So now they were hoping from release from the Roman Empire, this debilitating dictatorship that they had to contend with every day. They were completely unprepared for the message that they would be called to live differently within that existing empire. We can relate to so much of this. We've also been forced into new things coming at us fast. COVID with its ever-changing demands. Now we can, now we can't. Well, maybe we can, but maybe we shouldn't. And how about this? And if we did this, what would happen? And on and on and on. We're also constantly grappling with shifting ways to connect and worship together. Zoom was entirely new. Worshiping in person, surprisingly, has brought new elements too. And now we're engaging with our online worshipers. We have changed. Our world has changed. We've been confronted with more death on our soil in a short period of time than we who are living here right now have ever experienced. We've lost nearly 1 million people to COVID and its variants over a very short course of time in this country alone. How do we even begin to deal with that? This doesn't take into consideration the many illnesses and situations that others deal with and we deal with, and some people who die from them, as we heard earlier. There are new realities in our culture all the time. Intensified division and hatred. There's disillusionment with organized religion, yet people search for an anchor in our troubled nation and world. We may feel disoriented with all that's changing so rapidly on a daily basis. Like Peter, sometimes we handle things beautifully. Other times we do a face palm. It's heartening to read what Jesus' response is to Peter in these three instances. There was never shame, never blame, and never anger. In the first instance, there was affirmation. In the second one, there was correction. And in the third one, there was redirection. We as individuals and families and as a congregation have faced and we continue to face enormous changes and opportunities. We can anticipate similar outcomes to the things that come at us fast. Brilliant successes and abysmal shortcomings. But that's okay. As Jesus modeled for us, there is no shame and no blame. But as we follow the important directive, listen to him, we also will hear affirmation, correction, and redirection. We can be certain of that. What does our current driver's ed course look like as we continually adjust to driving in new terrain? I will ask you, and I ask myself, 3 questions to ponder and discuss as we move forward. First of all, what information about Jesus is as equally incriminating in our time as the statement, Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God, was in ancient times? Secondly, where do we risk derailing the misunderstood and hard to live out components of our call to follow Christ? And what are those components? And third, What have we thought, believed, and practiced for so long that we now think it's part of the gospel? We'll talk about these as we meet here right after worship this morning, and we'll continue to talk about that. We aren't given a checklist or a list of do's and don'ts. Rather, we are urged to listen to Jesus, to listen to the still speaking God as we drive around that farmyard again and again. When we get it right, there will be affirmation. When we're completely off course, we will be corrected. When we get too nostalgic about where we've been, whom we've always revered, and we're tempted to merge the past with the present, we'll be redirected to engage toward the future. It's actually an exciting time for this continuing ed, or this continuing driver's ed. As we continue to listen more closely to Jesus, we will also be affirmed. We will be corrected. We will be directed, but always without blame, shame, or anger. Let's be open to listen for and anticipate that Jesus will direct. Amen.